some numbers, and here's some of the scope of this huge problem outside of the impacts it's having on individual households and individuals' lives. So I think it's a very helpful big number that we can continue to talk about and continue to tweak. So we're happy to keep doing that.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve and Kyle, for all this amazing work. I know it was a lot of effort, and we really, really appreciate it. I think it's a great tool. Let me now turn to, as I said, we're going to go a little bit out of order and going to turn over to Ryan Kuhn. Just by way of quick background before he begins, as we were really trying to identify ways of not just getting some information about what's going on with rent collections and what the impact has been on landlords, we did various research to try to identify whether or not there were folks that had some insights into the smaller groups of landlords that are the predominant numbers of renters and property owners often in low-income neighborhoods. And I came across some of the work that Avail had done and published jointly with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and was delighted when I reached out to Ryan Kuhn, the CEO, that they were not only an organization that had a presence in Houston, but that really wanted to figure out how they could work with us as a task force, just as they've worked with others in other communities and nationally. So with that, I will turn it over to Ryan.
Great, thank you, Stephen, and thank you to everyone on the task force for having me this morning. I'm excited and eager to talk about the impact that COVID is having on individual mom and pop landlords, both nationally and in Houston. Before getting into that though, and a lot of us are probably familiar with these numbers, but I figure it frames the discussion a little bit. So just getting into kind of overall US residential rental market, the way that we look at and cut the US Census data shows that about half of all the residential rental properties here in the country are institutionally owned. They're professionally managed. They're owned by the big REITs and hedge funds and whatnot. And these institutional investors, are widely represented by organizations like the NMHC, National Multifamily Housing Council, the National Apartment Association. The other half of rental units here in the country are actually owned and managed by individuals like all of us here on the call this morning, who are oftentimes busy full-time professionals. They're small business owners, they're doctors, they're attorneys, they work in financial services, and they own these rental properties on the side, often to build passive income or to save for retirement. A lot of these individual mom and pop landlords also tend to be in minority communities, whether it's Black or Hispanic, and these rental properties are really a way for these individuals in these underrepresented communities to build generational wealth and move up. And it's these individuals that historically have been unrepresented in policy discussions. They've been historically very hard to reach. And they've oftentimes not had access to the same tools or resources as the bigger institutional investors. And that really is why my co-founder Lawrence and I started this company. So Avail, the platform that we offered, really does provide all of the tools, the educational resources, the customer support that mom and pop landlords and their tenants need. So everything that's listed here on the slide, and I believe the slides will be shared out afterwards. So, and then in addition to just offering kind of the nuts and bolts, the foundational functional parts of the rental process for these individuals, as a company, we're always looking for ways to better and give back to the community and reach beyond just what we do today. So one of the programs that we've launched is called Credit Boost. Just one example of this, where we're now reporting renter on-time payments back to the credit bureaus to be able to help them boost their credit score and improve their financial situation. We launched the company about 5 years ago. We've got a presence all across the country, and we're really the fastest growing player in the market. And in addition to building a successful business, as Stephen mentioned, we are focused on using our platform and using our product for good. So we've been partnered with the Urban Institute, NMHC, the COVID Eviction Defense Project, and we're really excited and eager to be talking with all of you today. As Stephen mentioned, I'm the co-founder and the CEO here at Avail. My plan here this morning is to talk through these 4 items here on the right. So number 1 is our pandemic response, along with some of the data that we've seen in Houston, along with a survey that we did in conjunction with LISC, and then a couple next steps. And then afterwards can definitely answer some questions. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, these individual mom and pop landlords really are the most vulnerable. They operate in this wildly fragmented part of the market where these individual investors are not represented. Further, they oftentimes don't have access to big pools of liquidity. So a lot of our research has shown that these individual investors are dipping into their savings in order to really just stay afloat right now. And unfortunately, a lot of that savings is running out. Back in March, really even before COVID was a major topic, we published our first piece of content back on March 10th about what landlords and building owners need to know about COVID-19. We subsequently did a quick survey, sent it out. We had more than 10,000 responses to a survey of landlords and renters within just 48 hours. So just a quick illustration of the reach that we have. Here on this slide, just an overview of some of the surveys that we've done. And then here, again, just a little bit more info on the work that we've done both with NMHC, with the Urban Institute, and the COVID Defense Project. We've got a team, a cross-functional team here at our company that's focused on this type of work. And really, as we've been working with different organizations across the country and working with officials from different city and state governments, we've really come to these 3 conclusions of what needs to happen next. And so, number 1, as Kyle and Steve and Jeff mentioned earlier, evictions are expensive. I believe the Kinder Institute put out a piece that showed that the annual cost to Harris County of evictions is about $315 million, and that's pre-COVID. So number 1, we need to prevent widespread homelessness. We need to make sure that tenants have a way to stay in their homes with a roof over their head. Number 2, these individual mom and pop landlords need the resources to maintain the safety and safety of their rental units, make sure that people are safe when they're living there. And I know that Curtis later will be talking about a working group focused specifically on the needs of landlords. So that's number 2, is just making sure they've got the resources to maintain and repair their properties. And then number 3, we really strongly believe that these individual mom and pop landlords are important parts of their local communities. These are individuals that live in the communities, they shop at the local hardware store, they give back, they contribute, they get involved in different charitable organizations. And we must allow and we must provide these individual landlords an opportunity to maintain ownership of their units. Quickly, looking here, this slide here, you can see the map here that's on the right. This shows Harris County, and it shows the presence of the almost 3,000 landlords that use the Avail product, and about 3,000 tenants who also use Avail throughout Houston. The colors here on this map are based on the Kinder Institute, based on zip codes that they've identified as either being low risk, medium risk, or high risk. And unfortunately, the city's been hard hit by COVID, and the unemployment situation is pretty dire. And I think the the data on the following slides will really show that this part of the market really does need help. Before jumping into exactly what's going on in Houston, I just want to set the stage with some national data. So this slide here on slide 18 shows the trend in full and partial payments across the country. This is data from more than 17,000 payments happening in each month. So you can see that basically beginning from March to April, there was a slight downward tick from people making payments, and then it has continued to slowly regress downwards. And in September, we're at about 4% lower payments at this point in the month than we were during March. This is across the country of all rental units. When we look at our data and we cut it by the bottom 20% of all rent prices, the situation gets a little bit worse. And a lot of us know that unfortunately the individuals living in lower rent units, lower rent properties are typically the ones who have been the hardest hit during the COVID pandemic. They're the ones that are most likely to have lost their job or had hours reduced. And so the percentage of these individuals being able to make payments is quite a bit worse than it was back in March. So about 6% lower. And again, this is data coming from our database based on real-time information. We look at these numbers day to day for the population of landlords and tenants across the country, and then select certain zip codes. This is just another way to visually see the data that was earlier on slide 18. And again, this is for more than 17,000 payments across the country. Moving forward, touching here a little bit on data that we're seeing in Houston. So one thing that I'll caveat with here is that the data that we can present on Houston here does have a much lower sample size than what we see across the country. So the data from nationally is very statistically reliable. Houston, there's a slightly higher margin of error here. But what we've seen, probably not surprising, is that rent payments were pretty steady in the 80 to 85% range back January, February, March. And then April, when we were really right in the thick of the pandemic and maximum uncertainty here in the country, payments were quite a bit lower back in April. As some of the different programs were enacted that provided relief back in May and June, we did see payments tick back up. But really here through September, we're already back to kind of basically where we were in April in terms of payments that had been made through the 20th day of the month. One of the other ways that we cut this data specifically for Houston is looking at rent payments where the monthly rent amount is less than $1,500. So the average monthly rent here for payments that are made on this slide are about $1,180 versus on the prior slide, these payments are around $1,600. So when we look at these payments that are roughly $1,200 a month in rent, we can see that there's quite a bit lower propensity to pay on time, and the payments that haven't been made at nearly the same rate as for the higher rental amounts. Moving on here, what we did here on slides 24, 25, and 26 is we went back to that Kinder Institute data and the zip codes that Kinder Institute had identified as low, medium, and high risk. And we cut our real-time rent payment data here at Avail based on the geographic segmentation. that was provided by Kinder Institute. So here, looking at the lowest risk zip codes, and again, I would stress that there's some statistical significance kind of margin of error questions here, where this is a lower population, so there's potentially some fluctuations, but it pretty clearly shows that back from March to April, there was a significant drop in payment behavior and payments being made by the end of the month, going from in the low to middle 90% down to high 70% and on downward from there. Here on 25, so this is looking at what were described as medium risk zip codes, and the payments are right there in that high 70, 75 to 80, 85% range. This population is a little bit bigger, but again, I would say that one of the takeaways here for us is we see this drop here from March to April, and really look at that as indicative that something happened, and that there was a big event that occurred. And so one of the things that I would say here is that that as those relief payments, as those relief programs were coming into existence back in May and June, those did have an impact on people's ability to pay rent. Finally, here we're looking at the highest risk zip codes, and again, cutting the data this way, looking at it. One of the things that's concerning here is if we look at payments that were actually made through the 20th of the month, the percentage of payments made through the 20th of the month in the highest risk zip codes is the lowest in September that it's been pretty much all year. So takeaway for me is that things are definitely getting worse. And with the CDC eviction moratorium, I think there's even further pressure on landlords who are not collecting rent, but still have to pay to maintain their properties, still have to make mortgage payments. And I think there was a question that came in around how many units overall this represented. This is in the, for Houston, our data is in the hundreds of units. Unfortunately, it's not in the thousands of units. So that's one of the things that I've touched on a couple of times. So moving on to kind of this next part of the slides here, fortunately was able to connect with Stephen about a month ago after we had done a webinar in conjunction with Urban Institute, and have had a number of discussions with Stephen from LISC. And one of the things that we did beginning a couple weeks ago, we actually sent out a survey to Avail landlords and tenants across the Houston area, not only to gauge the sentiment of what these landlords and renters are feeling, but we also asked for volunteers for a focus group, and we're in the process of connecting Stephen with those landlords who are willing to share their experiences. So talking through some of the findings here from the survey that we sent out, what it shows here is that unfortunately, these individual landlords who own just a handful of rental units, they're already falling behind. About 25% of people are behind on their bills, they're behind on mortgage payments, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what happens here over the next few months. Eviction, unfortunately, still remains as the dominant kind of mechanism for handling things if a tenant stops paying rent. So unfortunately, eviction, we learned earlier in today's meeting that evictions are really expensive, but for landlords, they look at eviction really as their path to remedy the situation. So one of the things that comes to mind is that there's potential opportunity for education just around other things that landlords and tenants could do. I know that at the beginning of the call, as Jeff was talking through the work that his working group is doing and the findings that they've had is that tenants are reluctant to have that conversation early. And that's something that we really promote here at Avail. And I think there could be further education around how that early communication can really be beneficial. So, and then lastly, kind of our third takeaway that we got out of the survey that we did really is that if the landlords are unable to collect rent, it would put everyone that we asked, when we asked them, if you're unable to collect rent, then how much pressure would it put on you? From no pressure to a lot of pressure. 100% of people that responded said that it would put financial pressure on them, and about half of the people that responded to the survey indicated that it would put severe financial pressure on them, both personally and with regards to their rentals. Number of kind of anecdotal pieces and pieces of feedback that came through here. One of the top ones here, just I'm not going to read through all of these, but it really talks about how everyone's focused here on evictions, but what about foreclosure? And like I mentioned earlier, I think that our view is that these mom and pop landlords are really valuable members of their communities, and really ensuring that a lot of these rental properties maintain local ownership is really key for having a healthy community of landlords and renters. These landlords are valuable members of the community, and we need to keep the rentals in their hands. Unfortunately, and then there's also kind of the jumping ahead to the bottom quote here that came through the survey that we did. I think there's still a lot of confusion and uncertainty around, even though there is a moratorium from the CDC, there's still a lot of confusion around renters still needing to pay rent, even while there is this moratorium in place. Kind of before I wrap up here and open it up for questions, I think kind of the three takeaways that I have really looking at data, talking with people across the country, is kind of three things. Number one, it's very clear that these mom and pop landlords and their tenants from across the country are really struggling, and they need relief now. Number two, and we zeroed in on this a little bit in a study that we did with Urban Institute. One of the troubling findings is that although all landlords are hurting right now, it's actually the Black and the Hispanic landlords that are hurting the most. And I can share, or someone on my team can share here in the chat, a link to the Urban Institute study that we did, or that Urban Institute published here earlier, that really highlights the pain that these Black and Hispanic landlords are having. One of the positives that did come out of that research that we did with Urban is that these Black and Hispanic landlords, while they are hurting the most, they're actually the ones that are most willing to work with their renters to develop payment plans and to try and figure out ways to work together. And then lastly, and I think we've touched on the topic of education a few times here, is that I think both landlords and their renters are really anxious right now. And there's a lack of very, very clear information, reliable information out there. And that's where education can really play a key part here. So moving forward, I just want to kind of wrap up, not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, but we have started working here at Avail with a number of different cities across the country really to provide different solutions for them. And it's providing this real-time access to information, giving them a platform for outbound communication to the landlords and renters, specifically the mom and pop landlords and the renters living in those mom and pop owned units. And then lastly, we are beginning to work with a couple nonprofits and cities across the country to start to structure kind of pilot programs for rent relief efforts. So I know that Curtis will be leading a working group on the topic here on how can we help these mom and pop landlords in Houston. We're eager, we're hopeful that together here Avail is able to be a helpful resource for Harris County, for the task force, for the working group. And I'm always here and available. My contact information was on every slide, and I believe Claire will be sharing the slides out later. So please, if there's anything that I can do or that my team can do to be helpful, please let us know. And then with that, would love to jump in and answer any and all questions that you've got for me.
Hi, this is Curtis. Thank you so much, Ryan. I've got a long raft of questions, but I'd rather let some others chime in. And as we get as I go through our presentation for the formation of the task group, some others could come up, but I think it would be good to just give people breathing room to ask you some direct questions in response to your presentation. I'm going to take silence not as interest and excitement with the quality of information. It's just that it was a good presentation. If we could move to the next slide, and for my presentation, Elaine. And by the way, thanks a lot, Ryan, for your work. I've got lots of questions around business models, and Steve can talk about it, but I don't want to get into it right now. I'd rather start in the committee with those questions and then bring it back to the larger group, because I think there are some competitors in the market that do similar things that you do, but not in the way that you do it. And I think that that's the important, what the intent is and how you sustain yourself in being able to do what you do.
Thank you, Curtis. Yeah, looking forward to being helpful for you.
Well, I'm going to take a quick look at the chat, see if there are questions that I should read out. There are thank yous from a variety of folks, but I don't see any questions. Okay, great. All right, Elaine, can you pop up the presentation and I'll get into it?
Actually, I guess I do have one question.
Oh, good.
This is Mary Lawler, and I'm curious if Avail, part of your service package, is assisting mom and pop landlords with accomplishing evictions. Is that one of the things that your company handles for the landlords?
Hi, Mary. Yeah, good question. Currently, we don't offer any type of eviction assistance. We believe that and historically, very few of our landlords have had issues and had questions with eviction. So to date, we haven't really focused there. I know that in one state in particular, we have started working with a mediation group to connect both landlords and renters with attorneys to help mediate when eviction becomes kind of the default or the go-to kind of process. But no, that's not something that we've gotten into yet.
Okay, thank you.
Ryan? Hi.
Yes.
Diana. I had a question in the chat. I'm sorry if I missed it in the presentation. I know that you said the survey was sort of in the hundreds for Houston, but do you have a sense of your market capture for Houston mom and pop landlords in, just to give us a rough sense of what the data is, like the survey and how far and wide that reached?
Yeah, great question, Diana. So we currently have about 3,000 individual landlords in the Houston market that use the Avail product, that use the Avail platform to manage their rentals. Those are predominantly single-family homes that are being rented out through the platform. So our survey was sent out to those 3,000 individual landlords. And so that's the reach on the landlord side, and then it's a little bit higher than that on the renter side.
Thanks.
Okay, should I go forward now, Stephen? Oh, good. Thank you, Elaine. I just wanted to highlight the fact that the Landlord Property Stabilization Work Group is being proposed in large measure as a follow-up to the work of the other two work groups. It's assumed that small and medium-sized landlords in our region are experiencing profound economic impacts. And I'm really happy that we were able to have Ryan make his presentation, because I think it addresses some of the questions that we all have, and it begins to point at some methodologies that we could quickly use to determine the variety of landlords that are being impacted. Clearly, one question is, what are the financial capabilities of the small landlords once you define them? So if you say a small landlord is someone who owns 1 to 4 units in a given property, a medium landlord is 4 to 25 units, where is that cutoff? And that's a question that we would quickly need to answer. I think we are on track to having that answer, and the group in its first meeting would focus on that. Also, the issue of financial security is a big question. There's one issue if a property is financially insolvent. It's another if the landlord and the property are close to financial insolvency. So this question of the integration of the property's income with the landlord's income is a real big question in my mind. And again, it's something that we ought to quickly be able to come to consensus on to set as a baseline for our conversation. The overall goal is to create a model of optimal program design. What is optimal program design? We're trying to address a very specific problem, and landlord support is part of that problem. And as we all know, the naturally occurring affordable housing falls into this category of affordable housing, but we don't know exactly what that number is. Again, we need to make I like to use the term swag, or scientific wild ass guess as to what that is, so that we can go forward and be prepared for the impacts that will be hitting us in January, I project, in very significant ways. How do we intend to do that work is through the definition of the landlord, as I've mentioned before, what is small and medium, and also the qualitative description of those landlords themselves, what those challenges look like for the different landlords as it relates to COVID-19, building a common knowledge and shared understanding of existing local financial support structures. How are they reaching out, and how can we supplement that, or how can we leverage those existing structures to support small and medium landlords? And then providing that evidence, and Avail kind of gets at a good bit of what that's all about. Next slide, please. The knowledge building process clearly is around data collection, a scan of traditional and non-traditional data sources. What do I mean by non-traditional sources? That is, sources that aren't typically tied to the housing question, and being able to begin to get some brainstorming going on that so that we can do that. Reviewing some of the national best practices, and certainly Ryan has shared some material with us about that, and Kinder can also be a support for that. And then impact projection analysis. And my earlier question to the Kinder team was around this issue. What kind of data do we know that's pointing to a problem, and what those indicators are, and how can we reverse that analysis to talk about what are some high probability, low risk strategies that we can take to get the most out of whatever resources that we have to address the problem. And then potential initiatives. Part of the issue is how do we prioritize those? There are lots of things that we can do, and this list begins to lay out some of those. Rental arrearage payment guarantees. What does that mean? Well, to facilitate the process of landlords participating in agreements with tenants that are agreements that are not onerous to the tenant, there may need to be a situation where those payments are guaranteed, and providing a fund to be the guarantor of those payments in the event that the tenant is unable to meet those obligations. And I suspect the same issues with the tenants. A lot of people will go ahead and leave, have voluntary eviction because they don't see any light at the end of the tunnel and their ability to make those payments. So having a guarantor to help build up everyone's confidence towards a path to resolution would be important. Innovative financing solutions. What are some of those structures? How do we leverage CDFIs and lending institutions to participate to the extent that landlords are in a position that they can take on either additional debt or have debt converted to lower interest rates or some other strategy that might be put forward. Landlord local government program for temporary housing of evicted households. There are some people who will just need to move. And if we can help them move before they are evicted so that they don't have that negative impact on their records, where can they be rehoused and how can that be done in a way that makes sense? How do we focus on naturally occurring affordable housing preservation? That is I think one of the key issues, that we don't want to see a decline in affordable housing availability because of this crisis. And then beginning the process of inventorying and registering affordable housing in some manner beyond what we already have. Right now, if you have a voucher or you are a large developer that has tax credits or some other kind of subsidy program, those affordable units are well documented. But the kind of properties that were being described by Vail and even some medium-sized landlords who are in the business of renting property may fall below that radar, that 50% of housing. How do we begin to describe that? Next slide, please. The types of members that would be good for this working group would be lending institutions, the real estate brokerage and consultant community. And what I mean about real estate consultant, for the small landlord, that might be tax accountants, that might be lawyers. They may have lawyers on retainer who are doing their evictions or their leases, that sort of thing. Real estate and small business associations. There may be chambers of commerce who are focused on small business and business districts, but those owners of those businesses are probably in the population of small landlords as well. And then nonprofits and advocacy groups. Some of the nonprofit organizations fall in this category. It would be good to reach out through the Houston Housing Collaborative membership to begin to see how they view this and who they see as potential potential folks who are impacted by this. Local governmental and quasi-governmental departments and organizations. The state and the county work with small landlords in a variety of ways, whether it's approvals for variances, for a variety of different issues, the constables. All of those folks have a view into this community that might be useful to help us make sure that we're addressing their concerns. And then the philanthropic, academic, policy development organizations and institutions, and even private organizations like Avail, who have certain insights into certain sets of data that could allow us to quickly begin to make our decisions. So we're probably going to need, at least a dozen or more people to participate. in order to do this work. And I'm going to be asking Steve to kind of reach out and get us a list together so that we can meet next week sometime. We haven't set a date, but I'd like to be able to set a date. Any questions or comments about this? While people are formulating their questions, I do want to now put a question back to Ryan, which I put off while during your presentation. Through your work, have you profiled some of your landlords in terms of their personal financial position, whether they are retirees, whether they are in this as a full-time business or supplement to their income? What kind of information do you carry as to describe these landlords?
Yeah, Curtis, great questions. We have done research on that. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I remember that roughly a third of people who use the Avail product are retired and own these rental units. In terms of other, I believe there's maybe another third of individuals who rental income from their rentals makes up a majority of their personal income. And then the final third are people that rental income does not make up a majority of their income. So I can follow up with you separately offline. I know that's kind of a rough guess, but I think we can probably safely put a third.
Yeah, because I think it's important for us to understand that there's some who look at this as an investment, and from that point of view, their own personal investment portfolio, this is a small subset of that portfolio. And that's one type of impacted and individual. And there's a different sort of incentive that we might provide for them. That's an equitable incentive versus an individual who sees this as a primary source of income or a potential burden on their livelihood, so that they might be in a position of being encouraged to sell and to get out of the business or something. And then there's this other category that I have no idea what the data is, and that's property that is being held in trust. That is property that the parent dies and the family now maintains it, and for a variety of reasons who are keeping it in a rental situation, but nobody is really treating it as an investment tool or primary source of income, but nobody wants it to be a burden on the family. So what does that impact, and how is it being impacted, and how much of the affordable housing pool is that? So those percentages, right now we're all looking at real big guesses, and so if we can kind of refine our guesses, because we're going to still be in a guessing game between now and the beginning of the year to service anybody. So so for those of you who want to be helpful in this, that this is where we're going to need assistance. I think a big question, again, and Ryan, you might comment on this, is what is that cutoff for what you define as small and medium landlords? If I'm a doctor or an engineer who has a $200,000 a year plus income, and I have a portfolio of maybe 4 properties of single family houses or 4 duplex properties, that's a very different individual than a retiree who might have the same property portfolio. So, and versus a property manager who's in the business of property management who might have 25 units, and is a reasonable cutoff whether or not you have reserves. And if you have reserves, what are those reserves dedicated to that property versus reserves that just happen to be in your bank account and that are not dedicated? Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. The way that we typically think about things here at Avail is largely aligns with the US Census data. And we look at individual landlords who own and typically self-manage their units. They typically own portfolios of 10 units or less. Now, that could be a combination of 2 5-unit buildings. It could be 10 single-family homes. We typically look at it in terms of number of doors or number of units that an individual personally owns. I also think, Curtis, one of the things that you mentioned that we certainly see a lot when we talk with these individual landlords is there's a lot of, I would say, commingling is maybe the wrong word, but the individual landlords' personal savings, personal wealth is very much intertwined with these rentals. And that's typically what we see at this mom and pop type landlord is they don't necessarily draw that distinction between the property and then the landlord's personal solvency. I think that when you get above that 10 unit threshold, 10 unit cutoff, there's probably a range from maybe, I don't know, 10 to 50 units, 10 to 100 units that I would probably put in that medium size. At that size and scale, you're probably looking at hiring a professional property manager. You're oftentimes looking at that more as a business, and you're making sure that your business is capitalized and that there's that wall between your personal wealth and the business wealth. So that's a little bit about how we think about it. And it's these individual mom and pop landlords, again, that is the core. I mean, that's the only type of people that use the Avail product today, and unfortunately are the most vulnerable right now.
And that would be the first order of business in our committee meeting. I think in that very first meeting, we need to decide where we want to place our energy. Clearly, the mom and pop group is a group that we want to support. The question is, do we also move into that medium-sized group? My gut tells me we ought to be looking at that medium-sized group in some way because they will have a significant impact on the market. And then the question of looking at the overall market, how this integrates from the large multi-property, multi-city organizations like RICS down to mom and pop. What is that range? What are their needs? And how are we assuring that their support? Because at the end of the day, the goal is to keep people housed and provide and stabilize the market. So again, understanding the affordable housing that sits in a continuum of the market is how I would like us to look at the landlord support or assistance strategy, but keeping in mind that it exists in a market that needs to be stabilized. So that's kind of the pitch, if you will, for the group. And if there are any other questions, certainly you guys should be brimming with questions eventually for Avail, and I'm going to invite Ryan to be a part of our committee. And we'll get back to those who sign up and who may be drafted by Stephen to join our first meeting next week.
Have you identified, it's Mary. Have you identified any small landlords to serve on your committee yet?
I have a call this afternoon with some folks, and I haven't gone back to connected, but yeah, we want to have the actual small landlords participate in this as well. The three people I'm talking to are an attorney who represents small landlords, a real estate broker who represents small landlords, and a tax advisor who represents small landlords, to get some names from them. And then Connective has been out, and certainly Avail has some that they could offer as well. So the goal is to get that list of folk by close of business Monday. That we can get some invitations out and to have a meeting by Thursday or Friday of next week, an initial meeting. But time is definitely not our friend here. We cannot wait around.
Really exciting.
Alan has suggested something in the chat, and I'm kind of going to look at it. Another grouping is those with residential 1 to 4 units versus commercial 5. Yes, I think there are a lot of people who may have mixed property. That is a commercial unit with residential above. And again, we will have to kind of tease that out to think about how we support those groups. And this is where the banking community can help and the CDFIs can help in terms of the types of businesses that they're supporting. There's a big concern that I have in terms of overlap with those groups, because at some point, if you are a business, you have been open to being able to get an SBA loan or some of those monies from the earlier COVID programs. And I don't know, I know there's some nonprofits who have gotten some of that money. And I want to make sure that we don't incentivize people getting themselves into a problem of applying for multiple sources of money for the same problem. So I don't want to overthink that, but that is a concern, to make sure that we're not encouraging people to get themselves in an awkward position.
Great. Thank you very much, Curtis. And
Thank
we'll
you.
certainly, anybody who wants to volunteer, please let us know. And if you know of any smaller landlords that would be worth our trying to enlist, that would also be great. So thank you both, Ryan and Curtis. Let me now turn it over to Representative Wally. Representative Wally, Judge Brown announced at the beginning, noted the letter, and we've now sent it out, but welcome you if you wanted to elaborate on it in any way or make any other comments. I know you've got a limited amount of time.
Sure. Can y'all hear me well? Thank you. So just wanted to thank the group, Stephen, and our co-chairs, Rick and Judge Brown, and Curtis, thank you for that presentation. So, I just want to thank all of you guys for continuing this work. Obviously, again, from the show of folks that are on this call, the 2 pages that I see on this call, I want to say thank you for continuing this work. I know that the county judge, in speaking with her, is excited to continue this work, and obviously there's some work by the task force should it want to continue that work. There was obviously some data collection, some recommendations, some best practices, and I think all you guys are kind of collectively doing that in this work. So I just want to say thank you to my staff, Rachel Petrosky, who's been working day and night on this with Stephen and with this group. But also Leah Chambers and the county judge's office, because they put an enormous amount of effort into formulating how can we best move forward. And so it looks like we got a lot of buy-in. So I'm just going to stop there. Should anybody have any questions, don't be afraid to reach to me, myself, or to my staff, Rachel Petrosky or Rahul Srinivasan in my Austin office. But let's continue this work. It's important work, and to the extent that we have recommendations, whether it's at the county level on the intermediate term or the long term, looks like there's some long-term strategies here, but also any immediate term strategies that we can implement here locally with the help of the county judge. And obviously she's bought into it. The whole staff has bought into it. So this is something that we care about, and I certainly care about deeply going into the next legislative session. So I'm going to stop I'm going to get off my soapbox here real quick, but thank you for your work, and we'll see a lot of good work come out of this, obviously in a collaborative way with the folks that are on this call. So thank you, and I'm plugged in. I'm ready to go work with you guys on this project. So I'll stop there. And if you have any questions or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out. For those of you that don't have my cell number, it's 281-513. I'll put it in the chat, 281-513-9242. I know some of you guys do ping me and text me, so don't hesitate to do that. But I'll put it in the chat, and I'll be glad to answer any questions, and I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Representative Wally. Okay, we are now in the home stretch here, and we'll ask Renee from Baker Ripley to give us an update on where we are on the amazing work that you all have done with the rental assistance programs.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Stephen, and thanks, group, for allowing us this opportunity to provide you an update on what's happening with the rental assistance program. I'll go through this kind of quick so we have some time for Q&A before we wrap this up. So as of this week, we have begun processing a number of applications for Harris County. But before I start with the applications, let me just go over landlord participation and where we are on that, since we're coming off of this discussion about landlords and how they affect and impact the whole system. So we've got close to 13,400 participating rental properties across City of Houston and Harris County. Of those properties, 6,445 owners / companies are representative. So you can see there's like a 2 to 1 ratio between the number of owners and companies to the number of locations. Of course, there's some property owners that are one location owners, and then there's some properties that have some owners that have multiple properties. One thing we can't capture and wasn't able to capture is how many units this represents. We did it basically just at the location level. One interesting thing to note is that of the 13,388 properties, only 7,200 of them have an active tenant application tied to them. So we've got a situation where almost half of the landlords who did enroll and submitted their properties as participating properties don't have any tenants who applied for the program. So I think there's still some opportunity there for outreach to those properties because the landlord's willing to help, but the tenant hasn't, the tenants for those properties haven't applied. Some other breakdowns here of landlord enrollment is as you look at it by fund. So we're managing both $20 million for the city and $40 million for the county. But when you break it down by fund, it's either because of where that property is located or because the property owner opted for one or the other program. If you'll remember, Harris County had initially, before the work of this task force, the city and the county had some different landlord requirements. And that's still kind of, most of them, as you'll see, 7,300 of the locations are eligible for both city and county. And that means that they're both located within city and county, and the owner opted in for both city and county funds. So the majority, at least over half of the properties are both city and county funds eligible. Then we've got 3,700 that are eligible only for the county. And that's either because they're located outside the city of Houston or they did not opt into the terms and conditions of the city of Houston. And then we have 2,300 that are eligible for city only. Again, there's some locations outside within the city of Houston that are actually outside of Harris County, and those areas are in Fort Bend and some other surrounding counties. Small pockets of property. So really most of those locations that are city only are mostly because they did not opt into the city terms. And some of those were the initial terms where the payment plan applied to all tenants that I think kept some landlords from participating in the city funds. One important thing to note is we are getting some very good participation from landlords confirming or correcting the amounts of due rent. The amount of due rent comes directly from the tenant originally through the tenant application, but in our agreement with landlords are to tell us and even refund us if they get paid if the amount that the tenant applying for doesn't coincide with the amount that's in past due rent. So we are seeing some good response from landlords in that regard. All right, moving on to tenant applications. A total of 40,334 tenant applications have been received as of Wednesday. We run these reports every Wednesday, even though we have a dashboard that goes out every day, but we try to summarize everything on Wednesdays. And that's because on Tuesdays is when we have the cutoff for payments to landlords. So as it breaks down for those 40,334 tenant applications, you'll see that 13,486 are eligible for both in city and county. 13,380 are eligible for city only. 6,612 are eligible for county only. And then we got 6,800 that are not eligible. One thing to point out is you'll see on this other slide, the breakdown for the both city and county is different on the landlord locations than it is on the tenant locations. And the reason for that is because the county has 50% of AMI. So that pushes some tenants who are over 50% of AMI into city only, which is 80% of AMI. So if we had some alignment there on the AMI, more of these 13,380 tenants that are eligible for city only might be eligible or would be eligible for city and county funds. But the AMI is what throws them into the city only bucket. Those that are not eligible at this point, it's either because they are over the income guidelines or they're outside the geographic region that's available for this funding. Again, they're either outside the city of Houston and outside the Harris County boundaries. So that's the number of tenant applications. What does that mean in terms of dollar amounts? Right now we have, for those tenant applications we received, it represented a request from tenants of $57.1 million. So that's how much the tenants requested, not how much necessarily they're eligible for, which I will review shortly. So of the 40,000 applications, that would total 57.1 million if we were able to fund everybody at what they requested, which we can't. Further, the breakdown is 18 million of the 57 million is eligible for both city and county funds. 18.6 million is eligible for city only. 10.3 million is eligible for county only. And almost $10 million of the applications received are not eligible, okay? So for those of you that are really good in math, you can see that if we've received $57 million in applications and 10 million are no longer eligible, then that means that we still have, we have $47 million of tenant applications received, which is less than the $60 million that we have available. So the message here is that funding is still available. We are still accepting tenant applications, and we're still even accepting landlord enrollment. So if folks still owe rent for any time from April to August, we should, as a community, continue to encourage them to apply for these services, both from the landlord and the tenant perspective. A little bit further breakdown that I put in here, just so you all know, is that we know and we expected this because tenants were going to try to pay their housing first and foremost. I mean, they may let other bills slide, but nobody really wants to be in a housing eviction situation. I think for the most part, human nature dictates that you're going to try to avoid to be in that situation. So you borrow, you dip into your savings, you forego other necessities and paying other bills to pay your rent. So it was no surprise to us that the breakdown of the amount of request is for recent months. So 60% of the $57 million was for August, 22% of the request of the $57.1 million was for July rent. Moving on, so what does it mean in terms of what tenants requested to what we could potentially pay at this time? So because the tenants are restricted into the total amount of either $1,900 or $2,100 for the city, $1,900 for the county or $2,100 for the city, we can't fund all of their requests. So when we remove and adjust for that, as well as for Harris County, if you'll remember, they required landlords to provide a 10% discount on the amount owed. So that 10% discount is not an amount that Baker Ripley will pay, it's the amount that the landlord will forego in order to accept payments from Harris County. So when you adjust both the 10% discount as well as the maximum amount allowable per tenant, we're down to 37.8 million in tenant applications. And the breakdown is 14.1 for both city and county, 16.2 for city only, and 7.3 for county only. Now, One other thing to know is that, again, I mentioned this before, is Harris County has a little bit more, or has more documentation requirements than the city of Houston. As such, there's going to be another 10 to 20% of this 37.8 million in tenant applications that may drop out because the tenant cannot provide the appropriate eligibility documentation. So again, reiterating there, you're going to see another drop off of about $5 million potentially from what we have right now in the pipeline. So that gets us to about $32 million that we have right now that Baker Ripley can process. And again, 60 million is the total available. So again, making the message clear that funding is still available to assist landlords and tenants here. So let's get us then to where we are in production. The city of Houston is obviously moving a little bit faster because not only did they have less documentation requirements, but also we were able to get started earlier with them. Harris County approved some changes to the program, which were good changes in our perspective, but nonetheless delayed the rollout for Harris County. So for the city of Houston, we've already paid $7.27 million as of September 23rd, which, since this is all city of Houston funds, that's almost 50% of the $15 million in city of Houston funds that are available. And that represents 5,111 tenants that have been paid, whose applications have been approved and paid. So we're off, and then the other thing to know is that over 16,000 tenants received on Monday their email and notification telling them that they have been selected for Harris County funding, and it provided a link for how they can go ahead and submit their eligibility documents. So on the Harris County side, what I'll leave this with you is that as of Monday, things are really picking up. Tenants are submitting their documents, and we'll begin processing applications and payments for Harris County in a much more rapid pace than up to this point, because again, tenants did not have the ability to submit their documents until Monday. So where does this leave us? Final thoughts on this is that a few things is that I would emphasize is that right now we're undersubscribed. We don't have enough applications in our pipeline to spend the entire $60 million. The second thing I want to leave you with is that Harris County will be accelerated now that the tenants have everything they need to submit their documentation. However, we do anticipate Harris County to take a little longer because the document requests from the county are more than what we have for the city. The third takeaway is that almost 50% of the city funds have already been paid out. And then the last takeaway is that in order for the $40 million for the county to be spent, we'll need to do something about the document request. And then the other thing that we floated around with Harris County is that they should consider at this point allowing for tenants to apply for September payments. Again, only April through August are allowed right now within the current program. So that's it, and thanks again for the opportunity to give you all this briefing. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm available by email or by phone should you want to follow up on some conversations regarding the rental assistance program. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Renee. Jeff, if you are available, we'd love to have you give us an update on recent eviction filings.
Sure. Do we have that presentation pulled up?
We will in a
I'll
second.
share my screen. Do we have that presentation pulled up that I sent over? Or
Yeah, I'm not seeing it yet. Do you have the ability? Did we give you control, or Elaine or Claire, or either of y'all able to pull it up?
Jeff, you should have the ability to share your content. If you give us a couple of seconds, we can get it pulled up.
There we go.
Okay.
We got it.
So the long and the short of it is that eviction activity overall remains steady. We haven't really seen a significant decline in any filings. Filings are still coming through. These things are cyclical based on the time of the month and based on the month of the year. So generally speaking, as we look at this 30-day trend in the dotted line, eviction activity remains steady, not going up, not really going down. Something that was useful and interesting this week was that I was looking at the top evictor file, the top landlords filing eviction cases in September for the month so far. And I looked up the Thicket Apartments, and sometimes there's insight that we can glean by looking at some of the outliers. This apartment complex has, I think, 264 units or so, which means that 61 cases filed is a significantly high eviction rate. And I just wanted to point out that this is fairly easy to do using the evictions dashboard, and just periodically checking in and looking over a time period such as a month or 3 months, and starting to see a massive turnover within one particular apartment complex. It's not possible to do this with all apartment complexes because some are bundled together in different ownership structures, but every once in a while things like this really pop out and can lead to better questions for investigation. So in summary, eviction filings are holding steady, and there's still pockets that are happening within neighborhoods such as Greens Point, which is where the Thicket Apartments is located.
Great. And Jeff, I don't know if you saw John's question in the chat box.
Let me see here. Yeah, so doing year-over-year comparison is, yes, we can do that. Yes, eviction trends hold steady year-over-year historically. What we're looking at right now is eviction filings that trail by about, we're looking at 30 to 50% of typical eviction filing activity. As somebody noted earlier that Harris County, we suspect, has more evictions than anywhere else. That doesn't make us look very good even when we're looking at 30 to 50%. But year over year, there's a 20-year historical review available on our website, and I can send out a link so you can really get a sense of the escalating eviction trends over the last 5 years, and then looking at what's happening this year. I would say that 30 to 50% is down, but you can't really compare year over year in this case. It's not a good faith comparison. What we need to do is compare to what's happening in other cities in terms of volume and eviction rate. And in that regard, we're still not doing pretty good. In terms of the average monthly filings, we're looking at, let me just pull this up real quick on the dashboard, somewhere in I think around 2,000, but it depends on the month. I'm gonna pull this up for you right now and give you an idea. Bear with me one more second while this loads. So for example, in the month of July, throughout all of Harris County, we had 2,100 cases filed, so 2,136. In the month of August, we had 2,253. And in September so far, we've had 1,595. So we expect that to probably hit around 2,000, 2,100 by the end of the month. In terms of tenant representation rates, great question. Throughout September, right now, we're looking at 1.5% of defendants who are assisted by attorneys. And that's, I think that's a little bit down, but let me just double check here. Yeah, in August, we were looking at 3.55%. So it's still extraordinarily small number of tenants who are represented by attorneys, but that number is less than half of what it was last month.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff.
My pleasure.
So the last piece I just want to announce is that we have sent out and will send out a link to the beta website that Elaine is now sharing that will sort of be summarizing for folks the overall work of the task force. Enormous thanks to both Jeff and Elaine for having constructed it. It will go, Elaine, do we have a sense of when we will have it go live?
So if you have any feedback on what's there, if you look, there's information about the task force. The task force membership is listed there. You can see the biweekly meetings, all the videos over there as well of our meetings and the presentations. And in the last tab, you can see the work streams that we have focused with the products that we have produced in each track. So if you have any feedback, let us know, and we hope that, you know, by next week we can make this live.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Jeremy and Rick, if you guys want to close this up, that'd be great.
Sure. So great information today. I think we're making really good progress. I really appreciate, Armando, your comments in the judge's letter, because this really is important work, and we need to continue keeping the constituent group together that we have, because it is a really amazing group that are diverse and all have different interests, but a similar interest, and that is a shared vision of trying to help people through this really tough time and with housing stability. So thank you so much for being here today and all your work. Jeremy?
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you to the presenters, very informative information. What I'm gonna do, I'm going to send out some advisements that we got from the Texas Justice Center related to the CDC order and moratorium to help you, help you and your organizations from the court's perspective of what it actually is, and onuses and responsibilities on both the landlords and tenants, and there's responsibilities on what the court has to do now as far as informing folks, because eviction filings are still happening, and if a tenant does not, give us that CDC order, then we have to move forward. So just for FYI, I'm gonna send that out to you all shortly. But thank you all. Thank you all.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.